And welcome everyone to this webinar, which we are organizing as a follow-up to the Open Source Congress, which took place in Brussels in September of this year. So this was the third such Congress, and the Congress is an event that is organized by and for the code hosting foundations of the free and open source ecosystem. And so we were very glad to have representatives from 6 continents, I believe, at the conference this year. The first congress was organized in Geneva. The second congress was organized in China, and so Brussels was chosen by the organizer of this edition, which is Eclipse Foundation. And we will we'll expect we'll be working together on a congress again in the future. Probably we expect next year, and the location and organizer of that will be announced at some time in the future. Today, we're going to talk about the report from the Congress, which has taken a lot of work from many people, and we're quite proud of this document that's now available. So we are officially launching it now. The download is not gated; it's available to everyone. You can take a look and you can publicize it and share it with your friends and comment. The purpose of this webinar then is to bring some of the experts that we had on the panels during the Congress together to discuss some of the key topics that came up during the Congress as changes that are being faced by the free and open source ecosystem. And then what we're looking for is specifically how can the foundations adapt to put the free and open source ecosystem into a stronger position and to deal with the new challenges that we're facing. So with me, I have three of the participants from the Congress, and I will let them introduce themselves. Although before they do, I probably should introduce myself. My name is Kieran O'Riordan. I'm the Director of European Policy at Eclipse Foundation, and so I was Master of Ceremonies at the Open Source Congress this year. And so I had the pleasure of working with all these people, and I'll now turn it over to, in alphabetical order, first Amreen.
Thanks so much, Kiran. Hi, everyone. My name is Amreen Taneja. I'm the standards lead at Digital Public Goods Alliance, wherein essentially I oversee the development, the management, as well as the promotion of the Digital Public Goods Standard, which is the baseline criteria for any open source solution to be categorized as a digital public good. And I'm a tech lawyer by profession, and I've been working in the regulatory policy as well as standard space for a decade now. Very glad to be a part of this.
Thank you, Amreen. Katie?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Katie Steen James. I'm the Senior U.S. Policy Manager at the Open Source Initiative. I started at OSI in February, and my role is to manage, track U.S. policy developments that impact open source developers. And I was very pleased to be a part of the Open Source Congress, and I'm glad to be here with you all today.
Sebastian?
Hi, thank you so much, Kiran, for having me. My name is Sebastian Reible. I work for Appel. We are the European Open Source Business Association. So we are the umbrella organization of European open source business associations in several member states. And I used to work in the European Parliament until last year, and have worked on quite a bit of the digitalization agenda. And now I represent open source and feel like I'm coming back home.
It's great to have perspectives from such different backgrounds. The purpose of the Open Source Congress, it was to stimulate and host conversations about these new challenges that we're facing. And so we hoped that by organizing the conference, we have managed to move forward and share some of the best practices and share some good ideas and really develop the thinking on what foundations are and what their role is in the broader ecosystem in 2025 and going forward. So with that, we've prepared 7 questions, and these questions were written to try and raise most of the topics that were discussed in the one-day event that was the Congress, and then we also had a second one-day event for stakeholders, which was a broader audience. Well, we're going to go straight into the questions. So the first topic that we looked at was the evolution of how policy work, which was never even called policy work in the past. It was legal work, and it was done by lawyers or sometimes by managers. And it's a fairly recent thing. It's the last 4 years or so that we've really seen specialized people in our ecosystem who work on policy. And so the question I'd like to ask our participants here if they could give their point of view on what the difference is between this new role of the policy officer in the free and open source ecosystem compared to the previous work done by lawyers and managers. We haven't decided who's going to go first on each of these questions, but Amreen, you were interested in this when we were discussing earlier. Would you like to start?
Sure. Well, this is an interesting question because I'm a lawyer who's also a policy advisor. But you can think of policy advisors as something like bridge builders, who play an essential role in connecting open source communities with governments and policymakers. And essentially, we translate technical realities into language policymakers understand. And this often also includes scanning upcoming regulations and identifying risks as well as opportunities early on, and coordinating strategy across projects, across companies, across foundations, as well as contributors. As the standards lead at DPGA, Digital Public Goods Alliance, my work is a bit more nuanced in the sense that I turn community needs into clear frameworks, guidelines, or standards, that policymakers can use. And because as the Digital Public Goods Standard is essentially it's an open standard, which means that we're always relying on the community for their input to make the standard more robust. So yes, I think the main work here is to work as a bridge builder, I suppose. That would be my take.
Yeah, I like that, bridge builder. Daisy?
Yeah, I could also just add, the bridge builder piece I completely agree with. And, the policymaking process, understanding it in the different contexts at different levels of government in different countries, and then even in the international space, understanding that process is a skill in and of itself that takes time to have learned what has worked and what doesn't work, and being able to look at the landscape and understand where different levers are available to the community to tap into. That is where I think the policy advisor, the policy managers are going to have a different perspective that is complementary to the legal expertise of a lawyer, but isn't exactly the same. So those two expertise really need to work in concert together.
If I may, I think the policy analysis part is really the one where the job of the policy advisor differs from the lawyer, because I, having worked in the European Parliament for 9 years, I did that policy analysis and gave the advice to change certain things or to bring certain things into discussion that would be important for the regulation that we were working on. And it's not, in that case, strictly necessary to be a lawyer. I think you should have an understanding of the legal framework. But I have to say, it was always a great opportunity to be able to talk to the lawyers that do have that overview of the legal framework. But my background is as a computer scientist, and I think that gave me a different kind of edge on the discussions.
Yeah, I think it's also important that when you make this new role of policy officer, it gives a certain permanency to the work. And this is one thing that we had in the past, was that a piece of legislation would pop up and there would be a crisis, and a few CEOs and a few lawyers would start working on this, and they do fantastic work possibly. But there comes a time a year later when they have to get back to their actual jobs that people were complaining about them not doing while they were busy focusing on this piece of legislation. And so the process of developing legislation is a very human and very political process, and the actual process is very different in reality to how it might be described in the procedures. And so you only really understand the full timeline of a piece of legislation when you've been through a full cycle. And if people keep leaving after the cycle ends, then we find it very difficult to accumulate the knowledge and know-how about how to work in these systems. So I think even I do think it's a very different role, but just having it as a role is also it improves the situation and gives that permanency that brings us the quality of work that we need. Which then brings us to the second question, was about within our ecosystem. And we have the free and open source ecosystem has always been very diverse, very each project is free to choose their own set of policies and to make all their technical decisions and to work together or to fork or do whatever they want. And so then trying to funnel this into a message to policymakers, it raises the practical or the structural issue of how do we organize our ecosystem to be able to deliver messages in a way that the policymakers want to receive them rather than how we want to give them. And so I'm not sure, Katie, is this maybe something you could comment on?
Sure. I mean, I think the establishment of the Open Source Congress and the meeting of this group is a good first step to get in the room and actually have some Chatham House rules discussions about where is there agreement on policy issues, where maybe is there not agreement, what does that look like? I think from my perspective, we're still in the process of kind of establishing long-term for the community what that structure might look like beyond just the Open Source Congress convening, once a year. In the context of the US policy landscape and the open source initiative, we have the Open Policy Alliance, which was created a couple years ago to try and give the nonprofits, the code producing foundations, and other open source ecosystem nonprofits a voice in these public policy discussions. And so that's a group that we convene at OSI, where we brief them on what's going on in the landscape. There might be public comment periods. There may be other opportunities for us to engage with policymakers. So that's one kind of structure that has been put in place that is under kind of OSI's umbrella to support the community. But I do think there should be kind of beyond the Open Policy Alliance, beyond the once a year Open Source Congress convening, a more regular engagement of all of our groups. And to that point about where do we all agree, where may we not agree, some of those conversations may have started, but I still think we don't have a clear sense on beyond like open source is good, it's beneficial, it's ubiquitous in all of our technology. We want to make sure that it can continue to be produced and open source developers can continue to do their work. But on some of these kind of specific issues around AI and even in the cyberspace, I think there needs to be a bit more discussion so where we know where we agree. And on the areas where we agree, that's what we should be pushing to the policymakers. And then, each individual kind of part of the ecosystem may have a different perspective on some things, and that's okay. But where do we have kind of almost full agreement or consensus, and how can we push that message in a clear, concise way to the right policymakers? We still need to, I think, do some work there.
If I may, I think it's quite important that we, more generally speaking, that we understand and value the differences in communication and of specific knowledge that we have in the different fields. Katie and Amreen have both said that it's so important to build bridges, and I was also going to say we need to bridge the fields of tech and policy on the other hand. I think one way of doing that is currently working quite successfully is by connecting with narratives that are understood by both sides, or that both sides can connect to, kind of. For open source matters in policy, that is in particular now obviously the discussion around digital sovereignty in Europe. But it can be about data privacy and security. It can be about cybersecurity, transparency, even education and skill building and commercial success of enterprises. I mean, that's what I try to connect with quite a lot because we represent enterprises. So that is that is one way of building real long-term relationships with policymakers. And I think one quotation in the report that we're looking at today is that it is so important to build long-term relationships and to keep communication channels open. So one advice, if I may, be a bit strategic about your own resources, pick your battles, understand what is really important for you and what brings you on to a long-term trajectory of interaction with policymakers.
Yeah, I think I'd like to agree with what my colleagues here said. And I'd also like to add that, the main hurdle today is fragmentation in the ecosystem. And because, the fact is that there are thousands of projects, but there's no unified voice per se yet. And I think that's where the roles of alliances and foundations, it's very important, where communities can align on key agendas together. And then it's also, good to have few trusted representatives who policymakers know and can call on. But at the same time, I would also say that it's very important to maintain that those voices are actually neutral and they are truly representative of the concerns of the open ecosystem at large, right? The second thing is that, Katie and Sebastian mentioned, there's a need to have clear internal communication pipelines within the open ecosystem, so that maintainers can actually hear about what's happening and they have a chance to contribute to the stance quickly, right? Because the goal isn't just to speak on, with one voice and everything, but it's also about sort of being coherent on the big high impact issues. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because it was always a challenge, like for the FOSS ecosystem, to generate a single opinion on topics. We're very comfortable with long drawn out flame wars and forks, and hopefully they'll merge in a few years' time. But there was somebody from the European Commission at an event that said open source is a black box, and the message they were conveying with this was that when they get two messages that contradict each other, or one message is from the open source companies and the other message is from the open source foundations, they don't have the understanding of the ecosystem to be able to tell how should I merge these, or which one should I take as being really representative. And this is it's something that we would see it as something that doesn't have to be solved in most situations, but in this situation, if we don't solve the problem, then we will be ineffective in our policy work. And so that's a structural challenge. We have to maintain all the diversity and maintain a place for every different approach within our community, but at the same time, at a certain level, when dealing with the policymakers, things do have to funnel in towards a certain single position. But that's a new-ish and ongoing challenge that we'll struggle with in the coming short number of years. But with that, I move on to then the third question that we came up was just about the difference that I mentioned at the start, about the difference between the legal work in the largest sense, which was originally focused on licensing. Like we used to decide the policies of our community by writing terms into our licenses, or by choosing this license instead of that license. But now the terms of our community are being imposed from external sources. It's the market regulations that are telling us what the rules are for interacting and publishing projects. And so this maybe is a narrower question, but would any of the three of you like to talk about the difference between the legal work in the broader sense 10, 20 years ago and the new situation of what we have to work on? If you agree it's changed.
Sure, maybe I can go first. So, from the legal perspective, I think traditionally open source foundations mainly focused on licensing, compliance, and sort of good governance, making sure that projects use the right licenses, they followed community processes, and they sort of avoided the legal risks. But now I think, governments are moving from that licensing focused frameworks to policy focused regulations, especially, in areas around cybersecurity, AI, data protection, digital infrastructure, around all of these issues. And this shift means that foundations can't just look inward at codes and licenses anymore. They now need to also understand policy impacts, not just the legal obligations, right? So in that sense, I think foundations are also being asked to play a more strategic, sort of like an outward facing role, so to speak, because they now have to explain to governments how open source actually works. They have to advocate for developer friendly regulations, and also they have to work on sometimes correcting misconceptions before around the open source ecosystem and such, before it actually turns into law, right? And it ends up harming the ecosystem, so to speak. So this also means that foundations must help projects navigate this new regulatory ecosystem and expectations that we have now. Things around documentation requirements, around risk assessments, around transparency obligations, or like safety standards. And this didn't exist as much before, right? So in that sense, I would also say that standards work is becoming even more valuable because foundations now have the opportunity to sort of shape clear frameworks. They have the opportunity to sort of shape best practices and technical standards to guide regulators, toward well-informed and supportive policies for the ecosystem. So yeah.
Yeah, I would also add, from my perspective, I think it's important to remember like licensing cannot save the world. I mean, it's very important for making sure that we can share things openly. But I have these larger questions that are broader than the open source ecosystem, but inclusive of it, around AI and other things, have focused some policymakers' interests because they're trying to, I think, put reasonable guardrails on technology that consumers are accessing, but it is causing them to look at developers, I think, in a new light, and not understanding how open source development works. There is a risk there for beyond legal kind of licensing repercussions. There may be legal liability that is now introduced for developers, for open source ones as well, for what might happen downstream of the code if it's in an AI system that then ends up doing something that a law has been passed that says you can't do. So that's I think licensing as the tool to deal with these bigger issues is kind of a risk that I think we're facing. And I think it mostly comes from lawmakers just looking for ways to, make things better for the public, and the licensing is there as a potential tool, kind of in their mind. So it's important for us to continue educating them about what maybe unintended consequences that would have, and encouraging other policy proposals that don't require, either put a lot of legal liability on an open source developer for something downstream they can't control, or require somebody to revoke an open source license if something happens downstream as well. So that's kind of what I've been tracking in the licensing versus policy space.
I think it's a new development that the regulator is really looking at software as directly as they do now, and kind of suddenly they notice they are touching on the open source ecosystem with that, that has so far gone unnoticed, and has just how do you say, oiled the cogs and the cogwheels in the background. Do you say that?
Yeah, and I just point out two small things as well. One is that in the past we kind of thought that we could ignore regulation because we always had licenses that would have a clause, for example, this software is provided as is with absolutely no warranty, and that's something that we have to, people sometimes have to hear, and 80% of people know this, but everyone has to know it, that in your license you can only disclaim warranty insofar as the law allows you to disclaim warranty, if there is a law that says you are liable if and that's an absolute, then having a disclaimer in your license doesn't absolve you from applying that law. And so I just think that's and then the second thing is that, as Amreen mentioned, there is more of this administrative work now for foundations in the procedures and in helping people to apply these policies and these regulations. And this also brings up then the structural issue of, well, how do you finance doing this additional work that nobody asked for? And when you help software projects out with this work, you have to ask them to perform procedures, and the response you get is not always gratitude. So this is just one of the things, a dynamic which affects multiple factors in our ecosystem. So with that, we could move to the next question. So this is then the question about practical steps for participation in the legal and the legislative procedures. What did we learn, or what are the best practices that we need to kind of spread within our ecosystem? Maybe Amreen?
Yeah, sure. So I think there are a few practical things that open source communities can do. First is, I think that we need to coordinate early instead of having a reactionary response to policy development. Because when we track upcoming regulations together, it's sort of much easier to show up with a clear, unified message. The second one I would talk about is, it really helps to have simple, authoritative explainers on how open source actually works, why it's safe, how different governance models operate, because if we don't provide that kind of clarity as an ecosystem, policymakers then fill the gaps themselves. And, that's when misunderstandings can sometimes happen. Thirdly, I'd also say that it's useful to have a small group of people, like I mentioned before, who can speak on behalf of the community, and because that essentially keeps the messaging consistent, and it helps build trust, and the Open Source Congress and other similar consortiums as well are an excellent way of doing that and to align on common messaging in that sense. Another big one is relationship building. I think that is also very important because, staying in touch with the governments before there's an issue, that also oftentimes makes conversations much smoother when something does come up, right? And maybe I'd also say that, from the standards perspective, having clear standards and best practices make a huge difference, because they show that open source by the end of the day has structure, it has accountability, there are responsible processes which policymakers appreciate, and finally I would say that timing matters. Even if our first response to something isn't perfect, I think showing up quickly keeps us a part of the conversation, and that is also a very powerful signal that the whole ecosystem in that sense is aligned. So yeah, I think all of these steps can really help us push the ecosystem in the right direction, and it'll help us show up in a more organized, in a more credible and ready way, so to speak. So yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Amreen. And just to build on that, I think the challenge with maintaining relationships with policymakers and their staff is, what do we do when there's not kind of a fire drill, when there's not an urgent, like something bad is happening and we've got to now talk to them? How do we maintain the relationship in between so that at the beginning of these proposals being discussed, we're getting a phone call from somebody that says, hey, I've heard about this kind of idea, be curious for your perspective. That's what we want, I think, long term, to make sure that we have a seat at the table in these crowded stakeholder conversations that always happen when a policy is being discussed, be it legislative or some kind of guidance in an executive branch situation. So what does that look like? And that's a strategy. It's a strategic choice to make sure we're in front of the lawmakers, even when there's not an active bill or active policy being discussed. And that can look like a couple different things, doing educational briefings, which isn't lobbying, but talking to them about what open source is, but always connecting it to their context and meeting the policymaker where they are. So that might be, bringing somebody from their country or their, in the US case, congressional district or something like that, or their state that works on open source to connect it to their constituencies that they care about, and maintaining that relationship, being in front of them as much as we can in the in-between time, so that we are one of the first, or at least, first few calls when these types of topics are being discussed, I think is really important.
I think it's so good that you said that before, Kiran, that the Commission here in Brussels saw open source as a black box, and it's just such a perfect example of why we need to keep explaining and why we need to seek these exchanges and try to make them just aware of that ecosystem that exists and that has gone unseen. I don't think that that other industries are much more united. There are also different opinions within other ecosystems, but the Commission will have experience putting kind of if they get a reply from this part of the industry versus a reply from that part of the industry, they will be able to understand why they might not be overlapping. And I think that's just a matter of establishing ourselves more.
No, I think it's a great topic of turning up in time and being early. I sometimes think about software developers, for example, who turn up a week before the vote and say, "Hey, I heard there's this big thing. I'm free for this week. What do you want me to do?" And I always think, well, if I turned up at your job and said, "Hey, I wish Emacs was a bit faster when it's processing text. I've got a free week. What do I do?" There's a certain lead time that's required to get involved in these procedures. And if you turn up early, it's a lot easier to participate in an effective way. So then, actually, before I get into the sixth question, I should just remind people there is a questions and answers button in the interface somewhere. You can put questions into the chat box, or there's another box with a question mark where you can put questions that you want to ask to the panelists at the end of the webinar. But then, so question number 6 was. How do we build these long-term relationships, and how do we make it easier for the projects and developers to have their message reach the policymakers? And so, policy officers and this sort of thing is one aspect of that solution, but there are millions and millions of developers, and we have a few dozen. I'm not sure how many, maybe it's more than that, policy officers who are really working on policy. So it's not that every project is going to have their policy spokesperson. And what do you think can be done to increase either the effectivity of the FOSS developers being represented, or the general understanding of the policymakers, so that they understand what's being said to them? We can go in any order, because I've got Amreen first for most of the questions, but would somebody else like to?
Maybe can I jump in first? Because I've seen this from the other side. I've been lobbied or tried to be lobbied by open source people, and I deeply appreciate it. But I've at times felt that they could know a little more about me and could already know that they maybe don't need to educate me about open source, or me in that case representing an MEP in the European Parliament that had positions made public. So I think it's important to have a lot of respect for the person you're talking to work on the assumption of goodwill, to find narratives that both sides can connect with, and to understand the mindset of the policymakers that you're talking to. So in particular, their interests and what position they are in. For politicians, they can mostly best get behind something that they can communicate to a lot of people and that a lot of people will be able to understand. So that's why narrative is so important, in particular when talking to politicians. And when talking to officials, in particular in the European Commission or other authorities, they face a lot of problems they need to solve. So rather than providing new obstacles that they need to solve or move out of the way, we should or we I think are most successful when we are offering solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could also add that at least I'll speak to the U.S. context. It's important to meet the policymakers and their staffers where they're at. So, in the case of the US Congress, for example, the staffers that work in those offices are responsible for probably 5 to 6 different topics. And so they are going to know a little bit about a lot of things, and they're going to be spread pretty thin. The executive branch, the federal agencies in the US, that's where more deeper expertise is going to be, because they're career, civil servants that probably have worked on this issue for or any issue for a longer time and may only be responsible for one or two. So depending on who you're talking to, you have to adjust your kind of messaging and the detail in which you provide it, or kind of where you start in the conversation of the basics of open source is going to depend on what part of government you're talking to. And there is also very likely for them to say something maybe that they heard from somebody else that may be not true or may not be completely the whole picture. And I think it's really important for us to, instead of kind of reacting like kind of defensively, just to explain and be very humble and respect, as Sebastian said, for the folks that we're talking to, would be my thought there on how to build the long-term relationships.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think one of the biggest challenges in the open source and policy worlds is that we operate with completely different working cultures, right? Because and in that sense, there has to be some practical ways to bridge that gap. I mean, from the policymakers' side, of course, they can spend more time observing how open source actually works, the pace of collaboration, the transparency, the volunteer-driven structures that exist in the open ecosystem. And on the other side, I think open source software maintainers can, benefit from understanding how governments operate. The fact that timelines are slower, the processes are formal, and decisions often depend on political cycles, along with technical aspects. So, from the standards perspective, I think there's a huge opportunity here, because standards, in that sense, they provide a shared language. Because when we translate sort of community practices into clear, documented frameworks, it becomes much easier for policymakers to understand what's actually happening under the hood. And in that sense, standards can sort of act like a cultural interpreter, so to speak, because they show sort of governance, the quality processes, as well as the responsible practices in a format that regulators can sort of instantly recognize, right? And from the DPG standard perspective, also, I'd like to add that, from the governance aspect, when we were updating the governance for the DPG standard, we actually introduced spaces for for expert groups to be created, where we get policy inputs concretely from subject matter experts, but at the same time they're actually shaped in the form of proposals, and they're sent out for community inputs, and they're dedicated community input periods wherein we can actually stress test this with the community in the sense of how this will work. So I think that overlap and that sort of alignment needs to be there between both of these sectors.
Interesting, complex topic indeed. So then the last question we have, and you can answer this question directly, or you can use this as the excuse to talk about your favorite topic, is the other similar-ish domains that are close to free and open source software. And so, and we gave the example of open science or open access. To the extent that these have had success that's different or beyond what free and open source software has had, what are the lessons that we can take from those different but related movements to maybe improve our own policy work? Maybe Katie, if you could
Yeah, I mean, since my background is open science and open access, I know this question was directed at me. And while, as you said, Huron, there are different movements, but there's a lot of similarities. And what I mean by open access and open science in the policy context is public access to publicly funded research. So we all know, our many governments fund research. In the past, they've often been behind a paywall because of how publishing used to work. So the community of kind of open access, open science advocates had been working for 2 decades, frankly, towards getting governments across the world to have policies that required the research they funded to be um, provided immediately to the public under an open license, like a Creative Commons license. But that took a lot of concerted effort in strategizing on messaging to be able to reach some of the goals that movement has been able to reach over the last 2 decades. And while in that case, it was a very specific kind of advocacy ask, which is we want a policy that requires publicly funded research to be open. And we don't have that same, direct ask in the open source ecosystem. It's more, we want open source to be supported and allowed to flourish and people be allowed to develop and share and build on each other's work. Some of the same, I think, challenges related to questions about security. If something is open, how can it really be secure? Questions about competition, licensing questions as well. Those came up in many of those conversations, and it required very specific responses to some of those kind of red herring questions, as I would call them, against the backdrop of a very powerful, lobbying push by other folks that had lots of kind of lobbyists on retainer and just had more resources and ability to consistently push their message. So those of us with less resources in that community had to really work hard through coalitions and be very clear about what we were messaging to policymakers. And over time, a coalition of both parties, and in the United States at least, were generally supportive of this. And so I think that the coalition building and the key messaging and key responses to red herring arguments that were heard, those lessons, I think, could be something we could learn from in the open source community.
Sebastian or Amreen, thoughts on what we can learn from other movements?
Sure. I think I completely agree with Katie, and I'd also like to add to this that, open science has built-in incentives in a way, right? Because publishing openly can help your career, so people actually do it. And I think in the open source ecosystem, we don't always, in that sense, reward maintenance and community building, the same way as we celebrate new features. And that's something that I mentioned earlier as well during the open source congress. So I think there's a lesson here in the sense that we should create ways to recognize maintainers and find better ways to credit contributions. So I think that is one thing that we should definitely borrow from open science. And finally, the other thing that I'd also like to say is that open science reminds us that openness isn't just about the code; it's also about the data. So, and especially in the context of AI, when we talk of open data sets or good metadata or clear data governance, so they are just as important. And open science has been doing this for years, and so open source, I feel, can also borrow from some of those practices.
So here in Brussels, we are just about a half dozen people that actively advocate for open source towards the European institutions. And often I get the question, and I think we've discussed it over the last weeks a couple of times, how do we manage to influence the European institutions against the massive mobilization of corporate lobbyists that amount to the hundreds here in Brussels? And well, at the same time, we are only 7 people. And I think, at least in Brussels, fortunately, currently, a good argument can still carry you a long way. So I think, I suppose, maybe that's a question of mine to Katie, the open science and open access advocacy was probably so successful because it answered to some of the questions or to some of the demands that existed in society and in politics. And I think we do have these same answers that open source develops or delivers for questions that policymakers ask towards the trust that, for example, we invest into AI and other technology, and open source has transparency as an answer, for example. So is that the reason why these campaigns were so successful?
Yeah, I mean, why a challenge over the course of that work was it only takes like one bad argument to tank what you're trying to do, where someone says you can't do that because it's gonna create all these cybersecurity concerns or something like that. And then back to my point of staffers having a lot of issues on their plate, they're not going to have the expertise or the time, frankly, to go back and kind of unwind that argument and determine is it real or not. I mean, that's kind of lobbying 101 is, frankly, I mean, it was good lobbying from the sides that didn't necessarily want this to come to fruition. So it took the relationship building repeatedly was really important on both sides of the aisle, so that, again, to the point I made earlier, we got phone calls when something was being potentially on the table, or somebody heard an argument that they weren't sure maybe sounded good, but they wanted to hear our perspective. And that was really helpful in pushing back against some of those. But we also spent a lot of time going through each argument that we had heard kind of opponents make, and writing clear responses to each one of them, and then circulating that with the policymakers that we worked with, and they would also circulate it with others. And then again, we also did briefings for folks as well. So it was it took a lot of time to kind of unwind the argument and communicate it in a way that was also simple and understood, because it's much easier to kind of throw in something that doesn't make a lot of sense but sounds bad. It's much harder to respond to those in a clear way, but that's what we had to do.
Okay, so those were our 7 questions, which we hope managed to give people an opportunity to discuss the key topics that were kind of developed during the Congress. Before we go to questions, just for the 3 experts, is there anything else that you thought of during the webinar that you'd like to add before we move on? And if not, that's perfectly fine, because plenty has been said. So actually, I'd already planned before we go to questions, I wanted to briefly discuss the near future, so to understand what will be affected by this new context. But actually, the first question is about the future. In any case, so I can start addressing the first question, which I'll then pass on to the experts. But so the question is about the next 10 years and what will that look like in terms of regulation and open source. But I already wanted to mention, so at the moment we were working on the Cyber Resilience Act. I'm going to talk about the European Union now, but that'll flow over into other parts of the world. But the big famous thing we worked on was the Cyber Resilience Act, and that dragged on for roughly 3 years. And that ended when there was a new election for the European Parliament, and then there was a new set of European commissioners chosen. So that it's part of this 5-year cycle in the European Union. And we're now just finished the first year of a new 5-year cycle. And so that's why there's kind of been nothing in terms of new legislation in the past 12 months. And the first 12 months it's easier work in the sense that the European Commission publishes a bunch of ideas and says, hey, can we get your feedback on like what should we do about semiconductors, and what should we do about cloud and AI development, and what should we do about the way we deal with standardization. And they publish, so they've published roughly a dozen of these calls for input that were relevant to us, and we did our best to respond to as many as possible. But it takes time, and we are with 7 people in Brussels, as Sebastian mentioned, and 7 scattered among 5 or 6 different organizations, and then there's a few people outside of Brussels as well who do this type of work. But the next phase then in this cycle is that the Commission, having received all the input now over the past 12 months, they're going to start publishing actual proposals for legislation. And so they'll publish the proposal, and once they publish it, then they kind of step back and they leave that then to the European Parliament and to the national governments. But I'm not going to get into the procedure. But the point is, we're now going to start into another section where each piece of legislation will be debated and voted on and amended, and this drags on for usually 2 years for a simple piece of legislation, or the full 4 years for a very complex piece of legislation. So on January 20th, if there are no delays, we expect there will be a proposal published for the Digital Networks Act, the Cloud and AI Development Act, and the Cybersecurity Act, which will deal with supply chains, which is critical for us. Soon after that, we will then get proposals for a new regulation on how to deal with standardization. That's called Regulation 1025. We will have a thing called the New Legislative Framework, which looks very boring from the outside, but it defines the terminology that's used in a lot of future regulation, such as in a commercial context. How do you know when software was distributed in a commercial context? And then we're even going to have things like the copyright directive, which is going to be revised in 2026, and that will be a question of copyright, but it'll probably be more a question of AI. And then we will have to reopen some of our own discussions about what we think of those topics. And that's not a topic we're going to directly discuss in this webinar, but this is just to give an example of the wide variety of topics. And I mentioned semiconductors. The name of the legislation is called the CHIPS Act, and so there is a CHIPS Act already, and it will be revised now in 2026. So we have an opportunity to tell the European institutions what we hope they would do on the topic of open hardware, on the topic of RISC-V. We have the possibility to tell them about digital sovereignty and what we think should be done in terms of avoiding lock-in and having control, auditability, and real security of our networks. Whether cloud infrastructure should be allowed to have an influence on which AI is chosen, or vice versa. And so, in one sense, we've got masses of opportunities, but then we also have the resource issue that it's very difficult to find enough time to work on each of these. And we are lucky that policy officers is a new sector within our ecosystem, but there are very few of us, and we have to interface between a very large number of projects and then a dozen or so different legislative proposals, each of which on the other side has up to 100 lobbyists for the larger companies and other companies that don't share our values. So the work that we've described now in the past 52 minutes, those are the complications that we faced in the last kind of 3 years as we move into this new phase where policy is the legal framework, and it really only has gotten started. The next year is certain to be quite extreme in the workload that we're going to be facing. And so I'll say all the topics that we've discussed, to the extent that we've solved these problems or we've improved the situation, we're going to have to continue to do this work and a lot more in the near and the medium term future. Would one of the three experts also like to say something about the near future and what they think will be needed, or whether our problems will go away or get more difficult?
Well, not to be a downer, but I think they will get more difficult. In the US context, what I'm trying to track is just the plethora of state level bills related to AI, given concern about what the federal level is or is not doing with AI. We're seeing a lot of state bills that I kind of mentioned earlier are wanting to put guardrails on AI. I think open source largely doesn't have a huge voice in those conversations. It's also a bit like whack-a-mole with 50 states. So that's something that I think is going to be a challenge for us, but that we're tracking. I'll also be, tracking any any discussions around potential export controls in the U.S. on open source software, although I don't think that's likely. It's still something for us to be aware of. And then also just the kind of sovereignty questions and what we may see the U.S. government kind of try and push globally, and just what pressure that puts on our community in general. And then the kind of continued questions of security and things like that. The notion that open source software can't be secure, and pushing back against those viewpoints in the increasing geopolitical tense situation that we're in are what I see a near and kind of long-term, but certainly near future challenges for the community.
The 10-year question is really a tough one. And Kieran has made it very easy for himself. He's only talked about 36. But I think what we're currently seeing very much in Brussels in particular is that we have this deregulation agenda, and it's motivated very much by the economy not working well, and by digital innovation not being at the level and at international competitiveness levels where the EU would like it to be. By the way, I researched a bit for a talk that I gave 2 months ago, and looked and was quite surprised to find that the whole promotion of digital innovation and innovation funding has been around for 40 years in the EU, because in the end of the 70s, it was only then that the EU digital field kind of fell behind the US. And since policymakers have been struggling to find the answer to that and to make Europe more competitive, so that's for certain going to continue in the face of international pressures mounting, which does make it more important for not only policymakers but for society to have a say over what digital technology we use actually does, and who gets to develop it, and who gets to access the data that it harbors. So I think these top developments at international level are at a are very much counterintuitive to somebody that's from the open source ecosystem, where international cooperation is what has made this ecosystem what it is, what has created billions and of value in this technology that has been created. Tariffs and export controls on open source, or on contributions to open source projects, or the European Union starting to only want to buy European-made software, is that realistic? I think what we see in particular in the ecosystem is that so many businesses and so many projects work across borders, and European businesses making money in the US and otherwhere abroad, that we cannot afford locking us down. We don't want to lock each other down, or our economies down, because we like the international approach that we've had for so many years, and it is the core element of the European Union to not be nationalist and to not be protectionist. So yeah, I think all of these tough questions we're going to look at in the next years, and I'm sure there's going to be a fight with the proprietary ecosystems as well, because they are realizing how well this digital sovereignty, the questions that just raises, how well that works towards open source.
Amreen, we have 60 seconds. Have you?
Sure. Maybe I can quickly round this off from a foundations perspective, because I think my colleagues here have mentioned, very well about what are the sort of challenges that we're going to face. But I think what we're also seeing here is that, open source software foundations going forward can't just be neutral hosts anymore, right? With these new regulations that are coming up, whether that's the CRA or the AI Act, I think foundations need to be built, they need to build a bit more structure around how open source projects understand and meet regulatory expectations, right? And along with the fact that there needs to be early engagement with policymakers, the fact that there needs to be some sort of shared resources, rather than expecting every project to sort of figure out compliance. I think we also need to make sure that, from the standards perspective, foundations will need to get more intentional about harmonizing across ecosystems, because after policy, I think standardization is like one of the key ways to actually implement how that will come into existence and how that will affect ecosystems. And I think by the end of the day, regulators, look for consistency. They look for clear definitions, trusted processes, and transparent governance. So having sort of standards, or aligning with external standards, so to speak, that will really help open source projects, demonstrate themselves as trustworthy projects without, having any other heavy overhead going in future. So yeah.
We have to leave it there. We're at time. Thank you very much to the three experts for giving a great summary and a great insight into all the different topics we discussed during the Open Source Congress. I've put the QR code on the screen there for people who would like to download and take a look. And we look forward to keeping in contact via the next Open Source Congress or possibly other mechanisms in between. Thank you very nice. Everyone have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.